How's it going, guys, and welcome to another Java tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be covering an array list, and we're also going to be covering what a try-catch exception is and how we can implement. So when it comes to array lists, you can add elements to the array, and you can't do this in a regular array because once you define the size of an array during declaration, you can't change it. In an array list, you can increase the size of the array as you go on. So an array list has a .remove function and a .add function. And how does this differ from a linked list? And I covered linked list in my previous videos, and I highly recommend you go watch that first before you come to this video. So in a linked list, you can also add or remove elements. However, one is faster than the other. A linked list is much faster and more desirable than an array list because when you're removing or adding elements to a linked list, it will occur in O of 1 time. So it will happen in constant time. However, in an array list, if you want to add or remove an item, every other item, let's say for example we add an item, every item after that element is going to get pushed over once to the right. If we're removing an item, the opposite happens and every item before it gets pushed. So you can see how this becomes very expensive when we have a huge array, let's say of 1,000,000 different elements. So that can be very expensive. So in a linked list, if you were to remove an item, you just take the previous item or the previous node and you just point it to the node that comes right after the one that you removed. And I covered this in the theoretical aspect of a linked list, and so that will make more sense if you watch that video. So let's go ahead and implement an array list in Java. So an array list is a class, so you have to import this package. So at the very top, I wrote import java.util.ArrayList, and this basically enables us to utilize the ArrayList class. Now, let's go ahead and define an array list. So when you're defining an array list, you have to write ArrayList, and then you, in these triangular brackets, you have to specify the data type. So in this case, we're going to have integer, and we're going to name it list is equal to new array list, and again integer, and then brackets. Here we have just defined our array list called a list. Now we can do several things with this list. Like I mentioned, we can add items to it. So we can add, let's say for example 10, and then we can also list.remove. So we can remove an item at the index value. So how do we do this? We don't specify the value that we want to remove. We specify the index at which it's located at. So here, this is index 0, 1, 2, 3. So if we want to remove, let's say this 2, we're going to write index value at 2. So now what we can do is we can print out every single item in this array. So let's go ahead and print out the entire list and see what happens. So here we can just do system.out.println and the name of the list. And so here it's going to print out 10, 4, 2, and 0. So if we remove this second index value, now it says 10, 4, 0. So I got rid of 0, 1, 2, this value right here at the second index. So we can add, remove, and there's basically a lot of things that we can do with an array list. This isn't very desirable because it uses a lot more time than a linked list. So that's why we prefer a linked list over an array list. You can add, remove, and there are several more functions, but I'm not going to cover those in this video. But once we cover some interview questions, I'll show you how to implement an array list. So now let's move on to a try-catch finally exception. So here, in order to show you guys what this basically does, I'm going to import the scanner package. So here we're going to utilize a scanner and basically divide two numbers. And we use a try-catch exception to catch an error. So any sort of error that occurs, we don't want the program to just stop. We want the program to say something like, hey, that is invalid, please try again. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. So we're going to implement this scanner. So let's call it input is equal to new scanner system. So we just created a scanner object called input. Now we're going to use the try exception. So what we do is we write try, and everything that we want to catch is basically in here. So when there is an error, we're going to utilize the catch right here, and that is going to use an exception E. So let's say, for example, we want to ask the user to input two numbers. So let's write system.out.println, please enter number 1. And then we're going to have some variable, so int n1 for number 1 is equal to input.nextInt. Instead of writing that, I'm going to just copy this. We're going to have another value called n2. Int n2 is equal to input.nextInteger. So basically we're getting two numbers from the user. And now what we're going to do with this is that we're going to divide the values. So here we're asking the user to input two numbers. And so we utilize the input scanner, and then we take the two numbers and we divide them together. So what happens if the user inputs 0 for the second number? And we know that if we divide a number by 0, we're going to get an error. We can't do that. It's undefined. So in this case, if we didn't have this try-catch, it would just stop the program and you'd get a runtime error. So since we're utilizing this, we can now specify and say, hey, if there is some sort of an error, then we tell the user. So we're going to comment this ArrayList out. So let's say we do 5 and 5. So of course it's going to print out 1 because 5 divided by 5 is 1. How about if we now do, if we write 5 and we write 0, it says invalid input. We cannot divide by 0. So that's the beauty of a try-catch exception. And now I also mentioned that there's a finally. So what happens in finally is we write the keyword finally and it just executes whatever is in here. So we could write, and this will just print out finally reached after all of this gets executed. So let's go ahead and make our program actually work. So we get 0 and then finally reached. So even if we got this error, it would still write finally reached. So no matter what, this finally is always executed. So that pretty much covers an array list and how it differs from a linked list. And we also covered what a try-catch finally exception is and how we can implement it. These are two very important concepts, and you need to know these in order to move on to my interview questions. And I really hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.